Why does the U.S. military dump tanks in the sea? It was a quiet morning in September 1945 when the indigenous villagers of a remote Pacific island awoke to a sight they would never forget. Asterisk on the beaches of Espiritu Santo, one of the largest islands in the Vanuatu archipelago in the South Pacific, American soldiers were driving their bulldozers, not to clear away the jungle for another runway, but to shove mountains of valuable equipment straight into the sea. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, crates of rifles, artillery pieces, typewriters, sewing machines, even stacks of brand new boots and glistening Coca-Cola bottles. All of it rumbled down the sand and splashed into the blue Pacific. To the stunned locals, it looked like the Americans had lost their minds. But why would the United States, victorious after World War II, destroy millions of dollars worth of equipment instead of taking it home? A tiny island, a giant war. Asterisk to understand why the U.S. military would dump perfectly good tanks into the sea. We need to step back a few years to the height of the Pacific War. Espiritu Santo, an unassuming island draped in jungle and surrounded by turquoise water, became one of the most heavily supplied locations in the entire Pacific theater. Between 1942 and 1944, the U.S. and its allies shipped in an almost absurd amount of war material as part of the island-hopping campaign against Japan. The Americans carved an enormous base, nicknamed Buttons, out of the wilderness. They cleared jungle, paved multiple airstrips, erected barracks and mess, and even built a movie theater. A fully functional dockyard soon bustled, with up to 100 naval vessels, while a force of 100,000 soldiers was stationed there at its peak. In total, 500,000 American personnel passed through the island over the course of the war. 2. The Vanuatu locals. The sheer quantity of equipment flooding their island was overwhelming. Asterisk piles of trucks, jeeps, cranes, bulldozers, and endless crates of tools and rations were stacked like miniature cities. To the Americans, it was simply insurance. Enough supplies to keep the Pacific war machine rolling, no matter what. And then, almost overnight, the strategic importance evaporated. By late 1944, Japan had been pushed out of the South Pacific. The island was bombed only once during the entire war, and the sole casualty was a cow named Basi. As the front line shifted north, Espiritu Santo transformed from a vital military hub into a remote storage yard. Asterisk post-war problems. Too much stuff, too little patience. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the U.S. military faced a problem no one envied. What do you do with a tropical island crammed with millions of dollars worth of wartime equipment that you no longer need? There were three options. 1. Ship it all back to the U.S. Logical, yes, but prohibitively expensive. Asterisk shipping space was scarce, and military logisticians warned that it would take months to move the surplus. Worse, the sudden flood of cheap jeeps, tools, and uniforms could crush post-war American industries that were just reverting back to civilian production. 2. Dismantle and salvage the equipment on site. Asterisk engineers tried. They stripped some vehicles for reusable parts, but most tanks and trucks were too robust to be disassembled efficiently. The process was slow, dirty, and unpopular. 3. Sell it to whoever would buy it. This proved the fastest and most tempting option. Soon, buyers arrived from Australia, New Zealand, and New Caledonia, snatching up tools, generators, and even armored vehicles for bargain prices. The soldiers were thrilled. Every sale brought them closer to going home. For many U.S. servicemen, the war had been won, but the wait to return home was agonizing. Morale plummeted. Letters poured in from families asking when they'd be back. With nothing to do but guard excess equipment, tempers flared. Asterisk some soldiers even protested, refusing to work unless reassigned or repatriated. In this context, the pressure to resolve the surplus issue wasn't just logistical, it was political. But then came the British and the French, the colonial overseers of the new Hebdes, nowadays known as Venezuela. The Americans offered them everything at 6 cents on the dollar, a fire sale price. But the Europeans stalled, gambling that the U.S. would eventually give up and leave the equipment for free. That would prove to be a big mistake. The Americans, tired of babysitting mountains of gear and angry at the stalling tactics, decided to make a statement. $1 million point, the day the sea inherited an army. On a bright September morning in 1945, the beaches of Espiritu Santo came the stage for one of the most dramatic acts of military waste in history. Bulldozers roared to life. Engines groaned. One by one, trucks, jeeps, tanks, cranes, and even unopened crates of Coca-Cola were shoved off the shoreline into the Pacific. The water churned with bubbles as the sea swallowed what would later be about in the millions of 1940s dollars. An inconceivable fortune today. The locals wide-eyed watched history sink beneath the waves. They would later call this site Million Dollar Point. The message to the Europeans was clear. If you won't buy it, then no one is going to have it. The indigenous Vanuatu, however, were left with a strange bounty. The Americans abandoned airstrips, docks, and roads, an infrastructural windfall that transformed the islands long after the war. Some civilian goods were gifted to locals, while many were repurposed materials for fishing, building homes, or starting businesses. Jeeps became farm equipment. Metal parts became tools. In a way, the local economy salvaged what the sea didn't. Take a pattern across the Pacific. Million Dollar Point wasn't a one-off event. Across the Pacific, the U.S. military repeated the process. Some surplus ended up in the Philippines, Vietnam, and China, where vehicles were repurposed. But many islands saw their lagoons filled with jeeps, bulldozers, and even tanks. Over time, the underwater graveyards developed an unexpected ecological benefit. The rusting hulks became artificial reefs, attracting coral and a kaleidoscope of fish species. Starfish, sea turtles, and reef sharks moved in, turning rusting machines of war into vibrant ecosystems. Marine biologists discovered that these reefs could stabilize sandy seabeds, prevent erosion, and help restore damaged coral populations. They became accidental conservation projects built from wartime waste. Tourism then followed. Today, divers come from around the world to swim through these eerie underwater museums, capturing footage of coral-covered jeeps and gun turrets. Now, home to clownfish and anemones. Consequences and evolution of the practice. As decades passed, the U.S. military realized that ocean disposal was not only cheap, but also strategically useful. Obsolete tanks and armored vehicles could be sunk to create reefs or used as live fire targets for Navy exercises. But there was a catch. It was an environmental risk. Marine biologists warned that lead, oil, and other chemicals could leach into the ocean. In the 1960s and 70s, the military quietly continued with some disposals. But Congress intervened in 1972 with the Clean Water Act, requiring that all vehicles be thoroughly cleaned and decontaminated before being sunk. This slowed the process, frustrated the Pentagon, and sparked debates that continue today. Environmentalists point to the potential long-term damage, while the military highlight the cost savings and the ongoing reef-building benefits. The irony is inescapable. Machines built for destruction now support fragile marine life. The legacy, beneath the waves, music today. The U.S. military still occasionally disposes of armored vehicles at sea, though under stricter controls. To the Pentagon, it's a practical, cost-cutting solution that doubles as training for modern weaponry. To the ocean. It's an odd inheritance. Forests of coral growing from rusting tank holes. Schools of fish weaving through the skeletons of jeeps. And bulldozers. On Espiritu Santo, divers still descend on Million Dollar Point, swimming through a surreal museum of war and waste. They pass by crates of forgotten tools and steel beams, now softened by sea life. What began as a clash of post-war economics and military impatience has become something stranger. A living reef, a tourist attraction, and an unintentional monument to both destruction and renewal.